Okay, thanks for sticking around for this last part of the lecture. We've got one more theoretical tool to add to your toolkit to help answer our original question, which was who controls the media? And I don't know if we're ever going to get an answer to that, but I'm going to talk about gatekeeping theory, which is a very kind of broad and flexible way of thinking about media production that scholars of communication and journalism have been developing really since the 1940s. Pamela Shoemaker and Tim Voss brought together a lot of that research in their book titled, well, Gatekeeping Theory. The central idea of gatekeeping theory is that the news, the content of the news, consists of messages. That is, it consists of information, and that information has to pass through a series of intermediaries before it actually reaches the reader or the viewer. If, for example, I log on to Twitter or Facebook and then click a link to read an article about some new experimental drug treatment for the coronavirus, the information, the content of that article has passed through a whole series of gates. There have been a lot of stops along the way, basically, from some scientist's laboratory all the way to my eyes. Along the way, a lot of information has been lost. The meanings of messages have changed, and that conveyor belt delivering information to me has depended on a whole system, a whole network of people and organizations and technology working in different ways with different perspectives and toward different goals. Maybe that scientist, our first gatekeeper, works for a pharmaceutical company, and the company's public relations officer, gatekeeper number 2, wants to generate buzz for that new treatment, in part maybe to attract investors, maybe a government grant. So when the scientist reports internally in the company a promising result from a clinical trial, the PR representative contacts a newspaper reporter, gatekeeper number 3, who covers, let's say, the health and science beat, and the publicist says, look, we've got this game-changing new drug. It could really mark a turning point in the fight against the pandemic, and I can get you an interview with the journalist behind it. So the reporter's intrigued, both because the PR rep has pitched it to sound like an interesting story, kind of about an underdog pharma startup, let's say, getting things done before the big established companies do. But before the gatekeeper can actually publish the story, unless they're kind of a citizen journalist just posting a blog or something, if they're working for an actual news organization, the reporter has to pitch his idea to his editor, gatekeeper number 4. So the editor then, in turn, is going to weigh the reporter's pitch against all the other pitches that have come in from other reporters that could otherwise take up space, the limited amount of space that exists on the newspaper's pages. And she, the editor, she decides, after considering a bunch of different factors, some of which relate to her ideas about what makes a good story and what constitutes newsworthiness. There are also factors relating to the newspaper's place in a larger news economy, right? Maybe she's more likely to run a story if competing news outlets have already done a story on that new drug that attracted a lot of attention. So anyway, she considers all these different factors. She considers the fact that the pitch came ultimately from a publicist, which maybe weighs against the story because it's kind of, they don't want publicists controlling their editorial lines. They want to be independent, maybe. But maybe the other factors in favor of publishing the story win out with this editor, so she decides to publish. In gatekeeping theory terminology, any factor that a gatekeeper weighs in favor of letting a piece of information through their gate is called a positive force, or positively valenced force. And any factor that makes them hesitate or second guess or even flat out refuse to pass along information through their gate onto the next gatekeeper in line is negatively valenced, a negative force. So anyway, let's say in our example about the coronavirus treatment story, the editor says to the reporter, okay, go ahead. And the reporter interviews the scientist who presents their data in one way, but then the reporter shapes his story and contextualizes what the scientist said according to his own ideas about the pharmaceutical industry or about what makes an interesting story. And then after that, it goes to the editor, and she adds a headline to the article that maybe changes the meaning of the message again. For example, by maybe she suggests in her headline, she writes the headline to suggest that this is really definitely the cure for the virus. And the headline actually has a lot more kind of confidence to it than the original scientist had, who the original scientists perhaps couched their findings in, well, this is tentative and it needs to be subject to more trials and peer review and all of this. So anyway, let's say the news article gets published, and that's usually about as far as most kind of traditional gatekeeper theorists go in the process, or as far as they used to follow the process, right? Just up to this completed news product that then appears in print or was broadcast by the mass media. That's kind of the mass media era way of thinking about gatekeeping, and that's mainly that's the kind of gatekeeping represented, for example, on this diagram here, which Shoemaker and Voss adopted from actually a 1969 article by Abraham Bass. So very much in the heyday of the mass media, when there are 3 television channels available to Americans, and where kind of there's an assumption that if the media publishes something, if television broadcasts something, then people are going to see it. But really, in our case, even after these professional media gatekeepers that I discussed, the reporter, the editor, before that, also the publicist, even after them, the gatekeeping process continues. And I think this becomes a lot more obvious kind of in the age of social media. So let's say my friend reads the newspaper that day and finds the article interesting. So she shares it on Facebook with her own comment. In doing so, she also becomes a gatekeeper. Or even just in reading the newspaper, she becomes a potential gatekeeper, letting some information through, but not others, right? There may be other articles from the same newspaper that she didn't find interesting enough to post on her Facebook page, right, to pass through the gates of her Facebook account. And she might also be, like other gatekeepers, kind of changing the meaning of the content, right? She adds a comment, and maybe she comments, look, more lies from the deep state. And that comment then affects how I read the article, right? The meaning is constantly changing as it passes through these different gates. Or I might not even bother to read the full content of the news article. I just read her comment, and maybe the editor's headline. So again, then there's a kind of stripping down of the amount of information that finally reaches me. And also, of course, to reach me as I scroll through my news feed on Facebook, Facebook's relevance ranking algorithm is also kind of working in the background as a gatekeeper, right? It's showing me some of the content that my friends have posted, but not all of it. Not there's other content that I'm not seeing or not seeing ranked as highly. And I'm not even necessarily the end of the process, right? I might myself not just be a consumer of the media, but I might myself act as a gatekeeper, right? If I tell my wife about the article that I just read, or I might tweet at the reporter or the scientist, in which case I'm not just acting as a gatekeeper, but kind of creating a feedback loop, right? Because maybe the scientist and almost certainly the reporter is paying attention to the response to the article, and then that's going to shape the way that they're going to go about gatekeeping next time they contribute to a news story. So this chain of gatekeeping can be kind of not just linear, but also circular, just adding to the kind of complexity of the process. Now, in that example, the gatekeepers were mostly people, humans, right? But I did mention Facebook's algorithm as a gatekeeper itself. And depending on which gatekeeping theorist you talk to, the technology involved in media production and media sharing might just be considered kind of an inanimate gate that a human gatekeeper controls. Or it could be kind of viewed, these technologies could be viewed as inanimate channels that just convey information. But the communication technology, the medium itself, might alternatively also be understood as a gatekeeper, a series of gatekeepers in their own right, letting through some messages, blocking others, and really transforming, as the human gatekeepers do, everything that passes through them. That's something scholars have been thinking about actually a lot more in recent decades, but it's true of all communications technology, even old communications technology, right? Imagine, this isn't that old, but imagine you're a reporter 100, 120 years ago. You're covering events in Cuba at the turn of the 20th century in the 1890s, and you communicate with your editor using a telegraph, right? Typed out in Morse code and transmitted via copper wire that extends underwater to Florida, and then all the way back to New York or to wherever your newspaper is based. And the telegram that you send can consist of just a short string of characters, right? In this day, you can't send an image or an audio recorder to your editor. And that combination of capacity to communicate and constraint on how you can communicate or how communication does occur is inevitably going to shape what appears on the front page of the newspaper in New York the next day. Our information technologies today might have much greater kind of bandwidth than the telegraph, but they still do very much, I think, shape what information is and isn't shared, what information does and doesn't reach different users. So I think that, and this is kind of an extended side note, but I think that including not just individual people, but also technologies is important in the way that we think about the gatekeeping process. And so it's worth paying attention to the development of technology, the regulation of media technologies, these kind of things as part of our explanation for what information goes from some event in the world into the mass media or into social media. Now, which gatekeepers, human or otherwise, a media scholar pays attention to the most, who do they decide to include on their list of relevant gatekeepers, depends kind of on their assumptions about where power lies and where to look for influence over the media. And also just who they study is based on who they kind of have access to study often. So for example, Herman and Chomsky in their book, Manufacturing Consent, which I already talked about, Herman and Chomsky are basically using a gatekeeping theory model when they argue that various media filters positively valence pro-establishment, pro-elite information, and negatively valence contradictory information. For example, the threat of flack that they discuss, flack for publishing information that the government or powerful corporations dislike, that flack serves as a negative force, a pressure on reporters and editors not to let such information through their gates. So Herman and Chomsky argue quite strongly that journalist gatekeepers are controlled by the elite gatekeepers who run the government and also companies that place ads in newspapers and on TV and so on. So they're really making a gatekeeper analysis Yet in their gatekeeping analysis, as opposed to, for example, the gatekeeping analysis of conservative media critics who argue that the news has a liberal bias because most journalists are personally liberal, Chomsky and Herman argue that the individual characteristics of particular journalists, particular gatekeepers, don't matter that much. They matter less than these powerful institutions and forces kind of at the systemic level, at the society level. But gatekeeping theory, as I said, is quite broad and can encompass both Herman and Chomsky's argument and the conservative critique of the media, right? Gatekeeping theory allows for the possibility that journalists do matter as individuals, that control over the media might actually be distributed in different ways than just elite control or elite capture, as the Marxist model generally assumes or asserts. Basically, there isn't the same kind of sense of inevitability built into gatekeeping theory as there is in more Marxist-leaning approaches. So gatekeeping theory thinks of news production as less centralized or more potentially decentralized than do theories that think of journalism simply as reflecting high-level economic competition. If control over the media is centralized, it's because specific gatekeepers are working constantly to keep it centralized, right? Not because centralization over control of the media is natural or inevitable. So gatekeeping theory kind of calls on us to pay attention to the details, I'd say. I think that also, speaking of access shaping your conclusions, I think that part of the reason that Herman and Chomsky tell this kind of big picture, slightly simplistic story of elite control has to do with the kind of study that they did, the kind of data that they had access to. They provide statistics at the organizational and media system level about media ownership and revenue, and they take some case studies of particular big news events and kind of look at news content in the later chapters of that book to show that in broad strokes, most mainstream media tend to cover stories in ways that conform to the interests of the elite. But scholars who have actually looked closer up, often by doing research based on fieldwork, observing journalists at work, have often painted a bit more of a kind of nuanced picture where each gatekeeper along the production line really does make some difference and have their own little piece of control over what becomes news. My own research, for example, is on news fixers, as they're called in Turkey, who are kind of one of the lesser known gatekeepers in the process of media production. So a fixer is a kind of a local guide and interpreter who assists a foreign reporter. I spent a few years talking with, also observing, and myself working as both a fixer and working as a reporter, hiring fixers. And I found that fixers do have some control over the news, but within constraints. The reporters they work for often will kind of boss them around when it comes to the routines of newsmaking, right? Deciding what stories to cover, where to go to cover them, what schedule to work on. And foreign reporters often don't trust fixers very much as being fully professional or objective. So fixers can't control a lot of elements of the stories that they contribute to, but I think nonetheless they're still significant as gatekeepers. A client meaning a reporter might ask a fixer to find them, for example, a Turkish politician who opposes the government to view. But there are actually, of course, lots of very different politicians who oppose the government, and the fixer's choice of which one of those they'll introduce to the reporter can shape the story in really significant ways. So that's kind of an act of gatekeeping of, okay, this source's information I'm going to allow through, not this other person who I could have chosen, but maybe I don't like as much what they're saying, or I don't think what they're saying will be as interesting to my client, the reporter. And the fixer's choice may in some way kind of be influenced by high-level factors, the kind of things that Herman and Chomsky talk about, like, okay, the fixer's client, what newspaper do they work for, and will advertisers be angry if a certain politician is interviewed? Maybe these play some small role in fixers' decision making, but they're not really determinant of, for example, in that case, which politician a fixer would choose to interview for a story. So in my own work, I've found gatekeeping theory useful because I think you do need to kind of look at this micro level of all the different actors pursuing their own interests and how they seek to, or unintentionally even, how they end up shaping news stories. Now, I've been referencing different levels, and I want to explain a bit more what I mean by the individual or the institutional or systemic level. We can kind of divide our explanations for why gatekeepers, particular gatekeepers, behave the way they do into different levels of analysis, by which I mean you can find some explanations by narrowing down the focus all the way to our brain chemistry and kind of evolutionary adaptations of patterns of stimulus response. And you can find other explanations for why the news turns out the way it does by widening way back out all the way to the level of the social system, which is basically what Marx and his successors did. So in different ways, actually, all the theories I've been discussing so far can kind of be fit within this gatekeeping theory paradigm, just at different levels of analysis. Shoemaker and Voss in their book identify 5 different levels of gatekeeping analysis. And so in practice, there's a lot of kind of overlap between them. Like, for example, what a journalist thinks at an individual level is shaped by the way that they were educated, which depends on the institutional level of schools, and also on their class, right? The class of the reporter and other kind of demographic factors which relate to the social system as a whole and their position in it. But still, I think it's worth kind of briefly discussing these different levels of analysis that Shoemaker and Voss use to basically organize their argument in gatekeeping theory. First up is the individual level. Now, scholars taking a psychological approach to explaining the news tend to focus in here at this level. Many have argued that our brains are hardwired in such a way that draws our attention, for instance, to anything new and weird over what might really be important. There's also arguments that we're hardwired in a way that makes us vulnerable to confirmation bias, that is, to trusting and uncritically accepting information that confirms our existing beliefs, while distrusting or second-guessing anything that could change our minds. So these individual level factors might shape the way that gatekeepers evaluate what's newsworthy, what's trustworthy, and also how to tell a good story. It's also at the individual level where we see, as I mentioned, one of the big conservative critiques of the mainstream media, particularly in the US, but also in Europe and elsewhere. Probably the most prominent study that made this kind of a gatekeeping argument was a book called The Media Elite that came out in the 1980s, actually around the same time as Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, but kind of from the opposite perspective. And Lichter and Rothman, the authors of the media study, surveyed journalists working for some of the most prominent news organizations in the US and found that at the level of their individual beliefs, these journalists tended to hold more liberal and left-leaning political views than the average American, and to vote for Democrats. So they inferred from this data that reporting also had a liberal slant, liberal bias, because these individual gatekeepers had some autonomy to report according to their personal individual values. At the next level up from the individual, we have communications routines. This is kind of the everyday ways that journalists and other gatekeepers operate. So, for example, if I'm a Washington, D.C. reporter and I have a routine of every morning going to a White House or a Pentagon press briefings, or a routine of calling the Brookings Institute for a comment whenever I'm working on a story, those routines are going to shape whose information and what kind of information ends up appearing in my stories. The third level up is the organizational level, which relates to how organizations like TV stations, public relations firms, government press offices, and so on are structured and the way that they're run. So if a news outlet is run for profit and publicly traded on the stock market, then maybe it ends up publishing more clickbait and fewer controversial stories that could threaten shareholder profits. This is one of Herman and Chomsky's and other neo-Marxists' arguments about kind of the inherent conservatism of the corporate media. So whereas the right-wing authors of the media elite claimed that the individual level of journalists, the individual level of journalist beliefs, that is, really made the determining difference for the ideology of the news, the left-wing authors of Manufacturing Consent basically ignore this individual level and focus on the organizational level, and also higher up levels that I'll discuss in this explanation. And of course, the right-wing authors of the media elite tended to ignore these higher level factors. So the point is, even the choice of kind of which level of gatekeeping to focus on can be politically weighted, politically motivated, perhaps. And one other kind of caveat or side note is that really the line between what belongs at the organizational level versus, for example, the routines level is actually super fuzzy, and frankly, it doesn't matter all that much how we classify different variables in terms of where they belong and what level of analysis, as long as we kind of keep in mind that the main point, which is that everything from the level of neurons up to the level of economies can make a difference for what news gets produced, by whom, where, when, and how. And so all of these different levels are worth paying attention to. Okay, so moving on, the next level up is the social institutional level, which considers not just the characteristics of individual organizations, but how different organizations involved in the media interact with one another. So a scholar studying gatekeeping from a social institutional level might, for example, look at the role of interest groups in trying to shape news coverage and the way they sometimes partner with news organizations. For example, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, will provide journalists with free photographs and videos that promote their causes, and sometimes even they'll provide journalists with press releases that the journalists copy almost verbatim. Communication scholar Oscar Gandy called these information subsidies. That is, other groups subsidize journalism, making it cheaper to produce news by sourcing journalists with content for free. Of course, the publication of that content benefits the subsidizer. And this issue of NGOs in particular kind of subsidizing the media is something that's been a focus of a lot of scholarship recently. There are a couple books by Matthew Powers and Kate Wright that focus on how this works in different parts of the world. Kate Wright's book is particularly about Africa, and how in Africa often aid organizations are the ones with the most resources, and so they end up often kind of producing or paying for freelance photographers and journalists to be doing coverage that ultimately makes it into the news. So they're actually, what aid organizations care about ends up shaping the news significantly. Herman and Chomsky's discussion of flack would also kind of fit in here at the social institutions level, right? There are a bunch of organizations, a bunch of institutions like government press offices and media watchdog organizations that try to keep journalists and news organizations in line by altering the cost-benefit ratios of letting particular information through the gates. And then finally, we have the big picture, the biggest picture, the social system level of analysis. Is there a capitalist economy in place? Are racist ways of thinking about the world the norm, internalized by journalists just like everybody else? Is it part of the general culture in a particular time and place to act deferentially toward figures of authority and not question their motives or actions? Right, so these very broad and usually very slowly changing social and cultural systems kind of trickle down all the way to the decisions by individual gatekeepers of what information to share and how to share it. Okay, so that's a lot, and I want to kind of wrap up as practically as possible here. So to do an actual gatekeeping analysis, you can begin with an individual story, or you can begin with a general trend that you identify of what is and isn't making the news and how it's represented. Then, to be kind of a gatekeeping theorist, what you do is just straightforwardly think through each step in the newsmaking process, each gate that information has to pass through in order to get published, get seen, and then try to learn about what happens at each of those gates, what the positive and negative forces are that sway the gatekeepers at each gate, that sway their considerations of what to allow through, and perhaps how to change what they allow through along the way. And you should question, a bit more broadly, why those positive and negative forces exist that are acting upon gatekeepers. And maybe your explanation of those forces at the gates really lies at the individual level, or maybe they go all the way up to the systems, the social systems level. But it's useful to kind of sensitize yourself, I'd say, to the possibility, at least, that there can be useful explanation found at each of these different levels of analysis, to almost have kind of these different levels of analysis ready as a checklist for analyzing your particular case study. Okay, well, I hope you found my explanations for these various concepts, like gatekeeping, like the market for loyalties, hegemony, naturalization, and so on. I hope you found these concepts to be useful for applying to the real world. I don't know if we're really any closer to answering my original question of who controls the media than we were at the start, but hopefully we can now at least argue about it in a sophisticated way. So, thanks for watching.